Chapter 8, Cette, Fete, Americaine, This Eisenhower Splurge. Elizabeth Bishop. In early 1951, Nabokov sent a confidential memo to Irving Brown outlining a plan for a major festival of the arts. With characteristically clumsy syntax, Nabokov never achieved the stylistic ease and grammatical correctness in written English that came so readily to Josselson. He explained that its purpose would be to engineer the first close collaboration of top-ranking American artistic organizations in Europe with European ones, and also of American artistic production on a footing of complete equality with European artistic production. Hence, it is bound to have an extremely beneficial all-round effect upon the cultural life of the free world by showing the cultural solidarity and interdependence of European and American civilization. If successful, it will help to destroy the pernicious European myth, successfully cultivated by the Stalinists, of American cultural inferiority. It will be a challenge of the culture of the free world to the unculture of the totalitarian world, and a source of courage and redressment moral, in particular for the French intellectuals, for it will again give a kind of sense and purposefulness to the dislocated and disintegrated cultural life of France and most of Europe. One Brown reacted hesitantly to the idea, as did Josselson, de Neufville, and Lasky. Nabokov had to summon up all his powers of persuasion to gain approval, and large amounts of money for his dream festival. Lasky was always uncomfortable with Nabokov, whom he described sniffily as the dandy of the revolution. People like Nicky were absolutely infatuated by the fireworks and the frou-frou and the razzmatazz. Lasky, the City College ideologue, had trouble accepting Nabokov's unique brand of aristocratic bohemianism. But even he had to concede that Nabokov's plan to introduce a note of flamboyancy, hype, propaganda, fireworks, Mardi Gras next Tuesday, or whatever, to widen the audience and show you're not just grim, bespectacled intellectuals with noses to the ideological grindstone, but aesthetes, fun-loving people could bring positive results. 2. Back at the International Organizations Division, Tom Braden was enthusiastic. Nabokov's claim that no ideological polemic about the validity and meaning of our culture can equal the products of this culture itself struck an immediate chord with Braden, who had recently seen a play staged in Warsaw under the auspices of the State Department and found it dreadful, like most of their stuff. It wouldn't impress people in Waterloo, Minnesota, let alone Paris. It was a given that the State Department didn't know its ass from a hole in the road. They weren't with it. They didn't know how to use what they had. Everything they did was third or fourth rate. With a few notable exceptions, like the Frank Lloyd Wright Show, which toured Europe in 1951-2, this indictment of State Department cultural initiatives was justified. Who would be impressed by window displays given over to celebrating the American way of life, which included an exhibit on the manufacture of nylon in the United States? And was the simplicity and charm of manner of the Smith College Chamber Singers, with their fresh and winsome appearance in white gowns, enough to convince French audiences that the center of culture had shifted to America? 5. Who goes to an exhibition of photographs showing the glories of America? Asked Tom Braden. I disregarded it as all balderdash. If you're going to do it, get the best. A.L. Allen Dulles and myself, we knew better. It sounds arrogant, but that's what we thought. We knew. We knew something about art and music, and State didn't. 6. Braden had also clipped an article in the New York Times criticizing America's foolish disregard of the importance of the cultural offensive, and pointing out that the Soviet Union spent more on cultural propaganda in France alone than the U.S. did in the entire world. America needed something big and flashy to make a decisive intervention in the Kulturkampf. Nabokov's plan promised just that, and by the end of April 1951, Braden had secured approval for the festival at a CIA Project Review Board. On the 15th of May, 1951, the Congress for Cultural Freedom's Executive Committee instructed Nabokov, as Secretary General of the International Secretariat, to move the plan forward. Nabokov immediately availed himself of a first-class air ticket to the States, stopping first in Hollywood to see his old friend Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky, like Schoenberg, Thomas Mann, and for a while, Bertolt Brecht, was one of the gods of high culture, who had disembarked from Europe to dwell, almost incognito, among the lemon trees and Beach Boys and neo-Bauhaus architecture and fantasy hamburgers of Southern California. In these incongruous surroundings, Stravinsky greeted his white Russian friend and promised to appear at the festival. Nabokov stayed long enough in Tinseltown to squeeze in a meeting with José Ferrer, who was so excited by Nabokov's plans that he later wrote telling him to return to Hollywood, as there was plenty of money there to boost the coffers, and that he, Ferrer, would do everything he could to help. After a whirlwind tour of America, Nabokov returned to Europe with a clutch of contracts and promises to appear at the festival, whose date had been fixed for April 1952. Igor Stravinsky, Leontine Price, Aaron Copland, Samuel Barber, the New York City Ballet, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, James T. Farrell, W. H. Auden, Gertrude Stein, Virgil Thompson, Alan Tate, Glenway Westcott, works or appearances by all these were penciled into Nabokov's program. Returning to Europe, he was soon able to announce that Jean Cocteau, Claude Debussy, William Walton, Laurence Olivier, Benjamin Britten, the Vienna Opera, Covent Garden Opera, the Balanchine Troupe, Czesław Milosz, Ignacio Salone, Denise de Rougemont, André Malraux, Salvador de Madariaga, and Guido Piovani were also on the program. Not surprisingly, given Nabokov's own vocation as a composer, the music section began to emerge as the most significant part of the festival. Here, Nabokov intended to counter, composer by composer, Stalinism in the arts. The political, cultural, and moral meaning of the festival and of its program should not be overt, his proposal argued. It should be left to the public to make its inevitable logical conclusions. Practically all the works to be performed belong to the category branded as formalist, decadent, and corrupt by the Stalinists and the Soviet aestheticians, including the works of Russian composers, Prokofiev, Shostakovich, Scriabin, and Stravinsky. 8. The scene at the Waldorf, where Nabokov had challenged Shostakovich to repudiate Stalinism's assault on music, was now set to achieve its crescendo. Nabokov's grandiose plans represented the first serious challenge for the CIA's newly emergent cultural propaganda machine. The organizational skills and fundraising powers of Braden's fledgling IOD were truly to be tested. A festival account was opened in New York, with the American Committee for Cultural Freedom acting as the laundry for CIA and State Department funds. The money was channeled through the Farfield Foundation, a dummy front or pass-through set up by the CIA expressly to deal with the cash flow for the festival, but later maintained as the principal conduit for agency subsidies to the Congress because of its usefulness. Financial support for the British part of the festival was secured through negotiations with IRD and Woodrow Wyatt, who, as a personal friend of the Secretary of the Exchequer, Mr. Gateskill, promised to raise additional cash. Braden's IOD was also directly involved in negotiating for the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Nabokov had already secured the interest of his old friend Charles Munch, the orchestra's artistic director. But there were problems. The orchestra's travel expenses alone were huge, according to Nabokov. The festival also clashed with the highly lucrative pop season, which meant the orchestra faced the possibility of losing revenue. But Braden was not prepared to lose what was widely considered the best symphony orchestra in America. So he turned to Charles Douglas Jackson, an ardent Cold Warrior who had taken leave from Time Life to work on Eisenhower's election campaign. CD, as he was known, was also a trustee of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Together with Julius Fleischman, president of the Dummy Farfield Foundation and the festival's angel, CD formally invited the orchestra to play at the festival. Officially, they were acting for the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Unofficially, they were representing the CIA, which had already pledged $130,000, listed as a donation from prominent individuals and associations towards the costs of the tour. The orchestra was secured. On the 1st of April 1952, the Masterpieces of the 20th Century, or Œuvres du XXe siècle, festival opened in Paris with a performance of The Rite of Spring by the Boston Symphony Orchestra, under Pierre Monteux, the same maestro who had conducted it 39 years earlier. It was a glittering event, with Stravinsky, flanked by the French president Vincent Auriol and Madame Auriol, in attendance. Over the next 30 days, the Congress for Cultural Freedom showered Paris with 100 symphonies, concertos, operas, and ballets by over 70 20th century composers. There were performances by 9 orchestras, including the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the Vienna Philharmonic, the West Berlin Reichs Orchestra, funded by Marshall Plan counterpart funds, the Suisse Romande of Geneva, the Santa Cecilia Orchestra of Rome, the National Radiodiffusion Française. Topping the bill were those composers who had been proscribed by Hitler or Stalin. Some, like Alban Berg, had the honor of being banned by both. There were performances of works by the Austrian-born Arnold Schoenberg, driven out of Germany as a Jew and a composer of decadent music in 1933, and characterized as anti-aesthetic, anti-harmonic, chaotic, and inane by Russian music critics. Paul Hindemith, another refugee from Nazi Germany, now derided by Stalinists for initiating a whole school of graphic, linear pseudo-counterpoint, which is slavishly followed by so many pseudo-modernists in Europe and America, and Claude Debussy, under whose impressionist tree the fleur du mal of modernism had been allowed to grow, according to Sovietskaya Muzika. Also chosen to represent the validity of the creative effort of our century were works by Samuel Barber, William Walton, Gustav Mahler, Erik Satie, Bela Bartok, Hector Villa-Lobos, Ildebrando Pizzetti, Vittorio Rieti, Gianfranco Malipiero, George Auric, listed with Darius Milhaud in Sovietskaya Muzika as servile teasers of the snobbish bourgeois tastes of a capitalist city. Arthur Honegger, Jean Francais, Henri Sauguet, Francis Poulenc, and Aaron Copland, who was grouped with psychiatrists Freud and Bornegg, philosopher Bergson and gangsters, Raymond Mortimer and Bertrand Russell, as false authorities to whom Soviet musicologists and critics should never refer. Stravinsky, who had fled Paris in 1939, conducted his own work, Oedipus Rex, for which Jean Cocteau designed the set and directed the choreography. The American Committee for Cultural Freedom had made a last-minute appeal for Cocteau to be dropped from the festival program, cabling Nabokov on the 9th of April 1952 to say they had just learned that Cocteau has signed the communist-inspired document protesting the execution of the Soviet spies in Greece. This is so obviously communist-inspired that the feeling here is that he should be dropped from the exposition program. He wasn't. The State Department paid for Virgil Thomson's adaptation of Gertrude Stein's Four Saints in 3 acts, which starred Leontine Price. Nabokov later boasted to Arthur Schlesinger, "I started her career, and because of this, she has always been willing to do things for me which she couldn't do for anybody else." Curiously, Frank Wisner's sister, Elizabeth, also claimed she had discovered and promoted Price, who referred to herself as the Wisner's chocolate sister. One of the great sopranos of her time, Leontine Price had the added advantage, for her sponsors at least, of being black. On the 15th of November 1951, Albert Donnelly Jr., who appeared suddenly in the American Committee as festival secretary and disappeared as soon as the festival was finished, wrote to Julius Fleischmann, "There has been mention here among interested friends of a certain Negro singer, Leontine Price, who was, I believe, Mr. Nabokov's protégé. She is supposed to be excellent. Could you sound out Mr. Nabokov as to whether we should try to get her for Four Saints? I have not as yet discussed her with Virgil Thomson. There is also a strong feeling that for psychological reasons, the entire cast of Four Saints should be American Negro, to counter the suppressed race, propaganda, and forestall all criticisms to the effect that we had to use foreign Negroes because we wouldn't let our own out." 9. The art and sculpture exhibition was curated by James Johnson Sweeney, art critic and former director of New York's Museum of Modern Art, which was contracted to organize the show. Works by Matisse, Derain, Cézanne, Seurat, Chagall, Kandinsky, and other masters of early 20th century modernism were culled from American collections and shipped to Europe on 18th of April aboard the appropriately named SS Liberté. Sweeney's press release made no bones about the propaganda value of the show. As the works were created in many lands under free world conditions, they would speak for themselves of the desirability for contemporary artists of living and working in an atmosphere of freedom. On display will be masterpieces that could not have been created, nor whose exhibition would be allowed by such totalitarian regimes as Nazi Germany or present-day Soviet Russia and her satellites, as has been evidenced in those governments labeling as degenerate. or bourgeois, of many of the paintings and sculptures included. 10. This was to be a kind of reverse Antarctikunst, in which the official art of the free world was anything the totalitarians loved to hate. And although these were European masterpieces, the fact that all the works in the show were owned by American collectors and museums delivered another clear message. Modernism owed its survival and its future to America. The art show was a great popular success, despite Herbert Reed's criticism that it was too retrospective and presented the art of the 20th century as a fait accompli, a closed period, attracting the highest attendance of any since the war, according to Alfred Bann, director of the Museum of Modern Art. Julius Fleischmann, a multi-millionaire famed for his stinginess, was in his element, dishing up CIA money and taking all the credit for it. His contribution of over $7,000 made possible the transfer of the art show to the Tate and earned the effusive thanks of the Arts Council of Great Britain, who reported that it was a resounding success. Already over 25,000 visitors have seen it, and it has had an excellent press. The literary debates were a mixed affair. Appearing on the podium were Alan Tate, Roger Caillois, Eugenio Montal, Guido Piovane, James T. Farrell, Glenway Westcott, William Faulkner, W.H. Auden, Czeslaw Milosz, Ignacio Salone, Denis de Rougemont, Salvador de Madariaga, and Stephen Spender. The press reaction was tepid. Critics detected a disparity between the caliber of first-rate writers and mediocre writers, and were bored by long-winded speeches. The journalist for Carrefour, usually sympathetic, being left-wing and anti-Stalinist, listened to Stephen Spender, but noted only his brick-red complexion and shock of hair pointing towards infinity. Denis de Rougemont was judged to be the best by far. Sober, clear, he skillfully poses the problem of the author in society. But Guido Piovane gave an address as stiff as his collar. It is difficult to understand him, then suddenly you are not listening anymore. At the door, an Italian journalist told me that he had left because he was bored. Authors were meant to write, he said. I felt this to be another fundamental truth. Another critic, regretting the absence of Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, pointed out that the other French intellectuals present, Raymond Aron, André Malraux, René Tavernier, Jules Monneret, Roger Nimier, Claude Mauriac, Jean Amrouche, all had the same political ideas, which meant that outsiders listening to them would get a false idea of our aesthetic and moral conceptions. Sartre had refused to attend the festival, commenting drearily that he was not as anti-communist as all that. Had he been there, he may well have felt, like his hero in Nausea, that he was alone in the midst of these happy, reasonable voices. All these characters spend their time explaining themselves and happily recognizing that they hold the same opinions. In her Roman a Clef, the Mandarins, Simone de Beauvoir described the same NY. Always the same faces, the same surroundings, the same conversations, the same problems. The more it changes, the more it repeats itself. In the end, you feel as if you're dying alive. First, there had been the God that failed. Now, apparently, this congregation had found a God who could not, the God of anti-communism. Certainly, Sartre's brand of selfish, non-collective existentialism could offer nothing to these communicants, who envisaged a progressive culture which was essentially consensual and presupposed a positive relation between the intellectual and that section of society, political and private, which supported him. Sartre was the enemy not just because of his position on communism, but because he preached a doctrine, or anti-doctrine, of individualism which rubbed against the federalist family of man, society which America, through organizations like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, was promoting. The Soviet Union, by the way, found Sartre equally uncongenial, branding existentialism a nauseating and putrid concoction. The Americans were very happy to be in Paris. Elizabeth Hardwick and Robert Lowell, who were traveling in Europe at the time, couldn't resist dropping in on the festival and reported that everyone there seemed to be having a marvelous time. Janet Planner, writing as Jeanette for The New Yorker, devoted the whole of her May 1952 letter from Paris to the festival. It has spilled such gallons of captious French newspaper ink, wasted such tempests of argumentative Franco-American breath, and afforded, on the whole, so much pleasure to the eye and ear that it can safely be called, in admiration, an extremely popular fiasco, she wrote. Like most other reviewers, she found the literary conferences dull. Faulkner, disappointingly, mumbled nothing but a few incoherent words, unable to find anything intelligent to say on the absurd topics set by the Congress Committee, such as isolation and communication or revolt and communion. The only Frenchman of any literary quality who agreed to appear was General de Gaulle's present political lieutenant, Henri Malraux, who merely said, "America is now part of Europe." 13, Fete Americaine became a piping hot French dinner table conversation piece. Combat, a non-communist left daily, ran a series by Guy Dumour, who concluded, "Confusedly, these cultural entertainments were tied to the signing of the Treaty for a European Army and to the Admiral Fechteler report, a reference to a report, possibly spurious, in which the Admiral was supposed to have advised the National Security Council of the inevitability of war by 1960, which, true or false, has fed the anti-American mythology and rekindled Europe's great fear." And this irritating mixture of chauvinism and inferiority complex, as regards America, so little known by the French, has bizarrely, but not inexplicably, found an outlet in decrying this exposition of the arts of Europe, to which the Americans, somewhat clumsily, wished to render homage. 14, but another piece in Combat derided NATO's festival and complained about the noisy presentation of these events, from which French musicians among the best have been forgotten, probably because they have never been heard of in Alabama or Idaho. But we would overcome our national pride if a very special target was not hidden behind the whole venture. Freedom and culture do not have to be defined by a Congress, their main characteristic being to bear neither limitation nor prejudice, nor sponsorship. For our part, in this newspaper where the words freedom and culture are always understood without any idea of compromising, we can but deplore the use which is made of these words in connection with the festival's manifestations. The value and interest of these events do not need the help of an inspired Barnum, nor an Atlantic flag. 15, Nabokov's original intention of concealing the propaganda value of the festival had failed. This had been, said Janet Flanner, the biggest cultural propaganda effort, either private or governmental, since the war, the propaganda focus being naturally anti-communist. In a France weary of the subvention of art to parti pris, the Congress's attempt to lasso the masterpieces of the 20th century to a political agenda was widely resented. In an open letter to the festival organizers, the famously intemperate head of the ballet troupe at the Paris Opera, Serge Liffard, angrily accused the Congress of undertaking an absolutely meaningless crusade in France against a possible and unforeseeable cultural subjection by communism. Apparently forgetting the Vichy years, Liffard asserted that France is the only country where spiritual domestication is unthinkable. If one considers France's long-past struggle for freedom of thought and individual independence, one can hardly understand how you dare come here and talk about freedom and criticize our intellectual activities. Dear sirs, you have made a big mistake. From the point of view of spirit, civilization, and culture, France does not have to ask for anybody's opinion. She is the one that gives advice to others. 16 Francs-Tireur, the leftist daily, challenged Liffard's right to speak as a champion of France, the cause of which he is not well qualified to support, inasmuch as the service of art is not incompatible with the devotion to the cause of freedom and human dignity, especially at a time when these causes were oppressed as they were during the German occupation, which did not prevent Mr. Liffard from dancing. Touché. The article went on, "Please let us forget about politics or propaganda. That gloomy mystification which puts creative minds in the artistic or scientific fields at the service of the state or the chief has not been established by the free world, which allows the spirit to blow anywhere. Freedom's wings have not been cut yet." 17. Francs-Tireur seemed to have recovered from that barely concealed anti-Americanism of a few years earlier and supported the festival wholeheartedly. It was now edited by George Altman, a member of the Congress Steering Committee. Also favorable was Figaro Littéraire, which praised the festival as great proof of unbiased artistic activity. Again, not surprising, given that the paper's editor-in-chief was Maurice Noel, a friend of Raymond Aron, who in turn introduced him to the Congress. The main paper, Le Figaro, was also closely aligned to the Congress through the good offices of Mr. Bresson, the editor-in-chief, whom Nabokov fastidiously cultivated over long lunches. At the hands of the communist press, the Congress received a thorough mauling. L'Humanité attacked the festival as part of a sinister design to facilitate the ideological occupation of our country by the United States, to have French minds imbued with bellicist and fascist ideas, the acceptance of which would permit the enrollment of French intellectuals in a cultural army, a reinforcement of the European army. Cultural exchanges become for the Americans a means to reinforce the infiltration, spying, and propaganda programs set up by Burnham and approved by the American Congress through the so-called security credits. The famous statement made by Mr. Henry Luce that the 20th century must, to a great extent, become an American century gives us the true meaning of the venture called 20th Century Festival. The United States nowadays are playing the part that Rome once played towards Greece. New Hadrians are not emperors anymore, not even presidents. They are bankers or car manufacturers. Read one article in Combat. Diana Josselson remembered the Paris of this period as brimful with anti-Americanism, a Yankee go-home mentality everywhere. The people one met weren't really like that, but they did have an idea that the typical American was gross. Many Americans were irked by this ungenerous response to their largesse. I could get quite distressed at Europeans if I allowed myself to, confessed C.D. Jackson. How Europeans can indulge in Americans go home out of one corner of their mouth, while out of the other corner it is, if a single American division leaves European soil, it is the end of the world, seems a little silly to me, and not in keeping with Europe's famed logical mind. 19 overall, Nabokov's festival ultimately contributed a further painful twist to knotted Franco-American propaganda relations. Phil, who was never persuaded that the festival was a good idea, later said that it seemed a very expensive cover story. But then it was picked up by Washington and they pushed money at us because they thought it was a great idea. It just had a kind of snowball effect. Was it a success? Well, what was it trying to do? Did it spread the message of cultural freedom? I don't know. It served its purpose as a cover story, I suppose. I mean, it introduced Fleischmann as the patron of all this stuff. It was a mixed effort. I guess it was a big show window for things from the U.S. to be shown competitively with European culture, and Washington got enthusiastic about that. 21 Melvin Lasky was unmoved. The Boston Symphony Orchestra cost a packet, he complained. In fact, the total cost of bringing the orchestra to Europe was $166,359.84. Lasky continued, I thought the festival was trivial. It's unimportant whether foreigners think Americans can play music or not. This whole thing wasn't a gravy train. There weren't oodles of money, as people have said. It was skimpy. So to spend such large sums on this kind of spectacular hype, it didn't make sense. 22. Anti-Americanism in France then was very strong, and the Nicholas's Festival was designed to counter that. It was thrilling, but it gave more weight to the idea that America was behind the Congress, Diana Josselson concluded. Nevertheless, the festival had two tangible results. First, it launched the Boston Symphony Orchestra as a billboard for America's symphonic virtuosity. After its triumphant appearance at the Paris Festival, the orchestra traveled through most major cities in Europe, taking in The Hague, Amsterdam, Brussels, Frankfurt, Berlin, Strasbourg, Lyons, Bordeaux, and London. The juggernaut of American culture, it became the CIA's answer to the agitprop trains of old. C.D. Jackson wrote excitedly of the overwhelming success and acceptance of the Boston Symphony on its European tour. It was not an easy job to put across, but from the standpoint of the great cause, it was essential, and it more than justified the preliminary blood, sweat, and tears. One of the greatest, if not the greatest hazards that we face in Europe is European non-acceptance of America on matters other than Coca-Cola, bathtubs, and tanks. The contribution of the BSO in this intellectual and cultural area is immeasurable but immense. 24, Braden was similarly enthused, and later remembered the enormous joy I got when the Boston Symphony Orchestra won more acclaim for the U.S. in Paris than John Foster Dulles or Dwight D. Eisenhower could have brought with 100 speeches. 25th. The second positive achievement of the festival was that it established the Farfield Foundation as an apparently credible backer for the Congress. This meant that Irving Brown no longer needed to fork cash from his slush fund, and he now began to recede into the background. The Farfield was incorporated on the 30th of January 1952 as a nonprofit organization. According to its brochure, it was formed by a group of private American individuals who are interested in preserving the cultural heritage of the free world and encouraging the constant expansion and interchange of knowledge in the fields of the arts, letters, and sciences. To this end, the Foundation extends financial aid to groups and organizations engaged in the interpreting and publicizing of recent cultural advances, and to groups whose enterprises in literary, artistic, or scientific fields may serve as worthy contributions to the progress of culture. The Foundation offers assistance to organizations whose programs tend to strengthen the cultural ties which bind the nations of the world, and to reveal to all peoples who share the traditions of a free culture the inherent dangers which totalitarianism poses to intellectual and cultural development. 26, first president of the Farfield and the CIA's most significant single frontman was Julius Junkie Fleischman, the millionaire heir to a huge yeast and gin fortune, who lived at Indian Hill outside Cincinnati. He had helped finance The New Yorker and boasted a bulging portfolio of artistic patronage. He was a director of New York's Metropolitan Opera, a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts, London, a member of the advisory committee of the Yale Drama School, a director of Diaghilev's Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo, and of the Ballet Foundation of New York, and a financial backer of many Broadway productions. Michael Josselson referred to him as the American Maecenas for the world of culture. His personal wealth and varied artistic patronage made him an ideally plausible angel for the CIA's sponsorship of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Braden later described Junkie as one of the many rich people who wanted to be of service to government. They got a certain amount of self-esteem out of it. They were made to feel they were big shots because they were let in on this secret expedition to battle the communists. 27. A fully roped-up member of Wisner's OPC from its early days, Junkie was an habitué of the dusty corridors of the sheds on the Washington Mall, proud of his role as a front, initially through the Fleischman Foundation for covert activities. But in the shakeup that followed the formation of the International Organizations Division, Junkie got pushed around. The trouble was he took it too seriously, said Braden. He began to think he was the boss of these fronts. They were just using his name, but he started to believe it was for real. I remember he started telling me what he wanted. He'd tell me he wanted his foundation to do this, and not that. And that was the last thing I needed. In the end, we offered him the Farfield as a kind of substitute. But it was only ever a front. Whoever was president was just a name, and those old guys from New York all sat on the board just to do us a favor. 28. The Farfield Foundation was a CIA foundation, and there were many such foundations, Tom Braden went on to explain. We used the names of foundations for many purposes, but the foundation didn't exist except on paper. We would go to somebody in New York who was a well-known rich person, and we would say, we want to set up a foundation, and we would tell him what we were trying to do and pledge him to secrecy, and he would say, of course I'll do it. And then you would publish a letterhead, and his name would be on it, and there would be a foundation. It was really a pretty simple device. 29, as president of the Farfield Foundation, Junkie could be presented to unwitting outsiders as the private angel of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. It was good to have a patron to display, Diana Josselson commented, and he loved his role. But the relationship became a chore and a bore, because it diverted Michael from more substantive things while he made a big show of being deferential to the big patron. 30. The directors of the Farfield met every other month in New York, where there would usually be a guest from the Congress, Nabokov, Josselson, or Muggeridge. They approved the payments, asking no questions, acting out what Muggeridge called the comedy as a patriotic duty. There was also an annual board meeting, which Diana Josselson described as a very big farce, of course. Michael would go, and Junkie. The whole relationship was farcical in a way, because we just played it straight. They would just pass on a set of pre-prepared actions. 31. As the Congress's Secretary General, Nabokov surely knew to which government agency he owed the extraordinary largesse enjoyed by the Paris office during his Mammoth Festival. Years later, he would confess to Josselson that Queen Juliana Fleischmann had never been plausible. He had always thought of the plutocratic junkie as a poor conduit. But officially, Nabokov knew nothing and maintained, just as implausibly, that, curiously enough, not for a moment did the question of money cross my mind. It probably should have, because it was hard to imagine the American labor union subsidizing a grandiosely expensive modern arts festival, and not in America, but in Paris, of all places. Not in my wildest dreams could I have expected that my dream festival would be supported by America's spying establishment, nor did I know that the fare for my delightful first-class flight to Paris was being paid by the CIA via the labor union's European representative, the cheerful Mr. Brown. And soon, very soon, that same spy mill would be using passing foundations to pump money to such groups as our Cultural Committee, to American colleges, to refugee orchestras, and whatnot. 32. Could Nabokov really have been in ignorance, unaware that he was entangled in a deliberate deception? Or had he, like so many of his contemporaries, become, like Graham Greene's Alden Pyle, just another quiet American? He didn't even hear what I said. He was absorbed already in the dilemmas of democracy and the responsibilities of the West. He was determined, I learnt that very soon, to do good, not to any individual person, but to a country, a continent, a world. Well, he was in his element now, with the whole universe to improve. 33.